On the night of April 14th, 1912, the Titanic, carrying more than 2,200 passengers and crew, en route from England to New York, struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and began its descent into the frigid ocean. Among the estimated 1,500 people who perished on the ocean liner was 30-year-old James Bracken. His body was never recovered. Bracken left a widow, Addie, who was as enigmatic as the murky waters that claimed her husband more than 100 years ago. A secretive woman, Addie would insist her husband was still alive, sever ties with friends and family, change her name, and go into hiding. Who was Addie Bracken? James Holland Bracken married Addie C. Greathouse on April 9, 1907, at Lake Arthur, New Mexico. Born September 8, 1881, in Beaver Dam, Ohio County, Kentucky, James, or Jim as he was known, was raised on a farm in the Bluegrass State. Although the marriage license states Addie was born in San Saba County, Texas, Addie would later say she was born in Brownwood in adjoining Brown County. Addie gave both 1881 and 1882 as her birth date, but family records state she was born in 1880. She was the youngest of a dozen children born to Archibald and Sarah Jackson Greathouse. Addie's father supported his large family as a farmer. Life changed for Addie during her mid-teens. Her only sibling remaining at home, Lily, married in August of 1896, and the following month their parents separated after a bitter argument. With relatives, Sarah and Addie ventured into New Mexico territory, where mother and daughter filed homestead claims in Lake Arthur in 1905. It was here that the Brackens married 2 years later. In 1910, 3 years into their marriage, the Brackens were still at Lake Arthur, where their names appeared on the federal census that year. James's occupation was listed as carpenter, though he became a well driller within the next couple years. While Jim traveled to explore business ventures, Addie went to Texas and visited with the family of her sister, Berry Greenwood. During this time, Jim bought a comical postcard and scribbled a message on the reverse to Addie. "My dear wife, I wish you would employ a secretary who can write, or better still, try your own hand at it. I shall have no further use for a post office box if you won't write soon to your dear old Jim." No date, postmark, or return address was given. While it was announced in Lake Arthur that Jim went to Texas, Addie's family said he traveled to England to buy furniture, yet the Bracken family maintained that Jim went to Spain to buy a specialized stock of cattle for ranching in New Mexico. At Lake Arthur, stories swirled that Jim Bracken was the victim of fraud. During this time, businessmen throughout the U.S. were being targeted by an imposter claiming to be Prince Alexander Demidov in a scheme known as the Spanish Swindle. The story involved the Russian aristocrat who was held in Spain as a political prisoner, promising to share a hidden fortune with the one who travels to Spain to bribe the jailers. Jim Bracken was among several Lake Arthur residents targeted by the imposter, but he had been advised that it was a hoax. Bracken was a fellow of good judgment, and also one of the last you would pick to be taken in by such a game, especially as he had been warned, wrote a newspaper reporter. What's known is that Jim went to Boston, where he boarded a ship bound for Portugal on March 19, 1912, the date of a letter he wrote to his wife, the last time she would hear from him. By mid-April, Addie grew deeply concerned that she had heard nothing more from her husband. Through the State Department, the American consul in Madrid, and with the aid of detectives, Addie learned that Jim had registered at a hotel in Madrid on April 1st and remained there until the 7th, the day he traveled to Paris and then to London. A search revealed disturbing news. A similar name, James H. Beacon, appeared on a list of victims who had boarded the Titanic at Southampton. Addie, however, was not convinced that the Titanic victim was her husband until White Star Line, the ship's owners, confirmed that the passenger had given New Mexico as his destination. When signing his name, Jim used an old-style R, which looked like an E, and caused his last name to be misread as Beacon. On April 10, 1912, the day after the Brackens' 5th wedding anniversary, Jim had boarded the Titanic as a second-class passenger in Southampton. 4 days into the trip, the Titanic hit an iceberg at 11:40 p.m., April 14th. An agonizing 2 hours and 40 minutes later, the sea claimed the vessel, plunging remaining passengers into a watery grave.
In our boat, there were 7 men, about 20 women, and several children. The night was dark. 20 minutes after leaving the Titanic, we heard an explosion, and the vessel appeared to split in two and sank. Constance Willard.
The shock of learning that her husband had lost his life on the luxury liner left the widow in a state of hysterical paralysis, as written in a report by the Red Cross Emergency Relief Committee, which described her as an invalid. Her physician states that she can never hope to be in any better health, and that she will never be able to do even light, regular work. Yet Addie did manage to make a full recovery. Ernest P. Bicknell, as director of the American Red Cross, had organized the Titanic Relief Fund and raised more than $160,000 for the ill-fated ship's surviving passengers and families of victims. An 1851 law that limited the liability of ship owners greatly impacted claims against the company. On October 3, 1912, the Titanic's owners filed a petition to limit its liability, stating that a large number of claims have been presented against the petitioner for loss of life and for loss of personal effects of passengers on the Titanic. One of those making a death claim was identified by the company in the petition as Mrs. James H. Bracken, widow. In September of 1912, 5 months after the sinking of the Titanic, the Red Cross Emergency Relief Committee wrote to Addie and enclosed a $200 check, more than $4,700 in today's economy, to cover her immediate expenses. When Addie didn't answer the letter or cash the check, the committee sent a replacement voucher for the same amount a month later. On October 23rd, W. Frank Persons, the committee director, personally wrote to Addie and requested, "If any different circumstances have arisen in your condition and plans, we shall be glad to have information concerning them." A letter postmarked December 6, 1912, from the New York American Titanic Relief Fund requested receipt desired. Addie decided to remain in New Mexico to secure title to Jim's homestead and then sell the 160-acre tract. The land patent was issued in her name on June 25, 1913. Addie lived in Sweetwater, Texas, as of February 1917, when she received a letter from a friend 60 miles away in Ballinger.
Well, I guess you have simply forgotten me, or just don't mean to write. I don't know which. Not one word from you. Well, I can't tell you how awfully disappointed I was. When are you coming over to see me? Ever? Maudie LaGrove.
Addie moved to El Paso by early 1918, staying with her sister and brother-in-law, Lily and Joseph Boyd. Lily was expecting her 6th child, Faye, born in May of that year.
She was living with my mother when I was born, and, in fact, took my mother to the hospital the day I was born. Faye Phelps.
From her account at First National Bank in El Paso, Addie withdrew $10, $15, or $30 per month, apparently for living expenses.
She had some property and a considerable amount of money in the bank in El Paso, which the Red Cross deposited to her account, and I've heard that she refused the money and let the property go for taxes. Faye Phelps.
Addie was still in El Paso by April of 1922. Her mother, Sarah Greathouse, died that month, and Addie was the informant for her mother's death certificate. Addie was often ill the following year. Her sister, Lily Boyd, moved to Port Arthur, where she wrote a letter to their sister Belle and mentioned Addie.
I've dreamed about Addie an awful lot here of late. She has had so much sickness that it's time for her to have a rest. Lily Boyd.
Addie returned to the home of her sister Berry Greenwood for a lengthy visit. Something happened during that stay with the Greenwoods, prompting Addie's announcement that she was leaving and that she would never speak to any of them again. But that vow would extend beyond the Greenwoods. She severed ties with everyone she knew.
My grand-aunt, Ethel Lovell, told me that she and her husband Henry were the ones who took Addie to the train station.
My aunt said they tried repeatedly to get Addie to explain why she was upset, but that Addie refused to discuss it. She insisted that she was leaving and that they would never see or hear from her again.
So far as I know, no one has ever heard from her or of her since she told them they wouldn't see her again and got on the train and left. I don't know why she got so mad at the family or any other details. Faye Phelps.
A story passed through the family of one of Addie's brothers, Ben Greathouse, says that she left because she didn't want to hear anyone tell her that Jim Bracken was dead. At some point, Addie convinced herself that Jim had survived the sinking of the Titanic. In her abrupt leave, she left behind a trunk containing what may have been one of her most treasured possessions, a gold-framed portrait of Jim Bracken.
Addie's falling out may have been with Berry Greenwood, my great-grandmother. From what I've been told, the two sisters were not ones to forgive and forget, and Belle did not believe in apologizing.
When I was growing up, every time we went anywhere that anyone knew her, I would hear this comment: "She's just like Addie." Even to personality, I gather she was quite temperamental and had very little patience with anyone. Faye Phelps.
What became of Jim Bracken's mysterious widow?
For many years, the Red Cross tried to find her without success as far as I know. I remember their making inquiries of my mother several times, perhaps every 2 or 3 years. Faye Phelps.
To hide, Addie assumed an alias, Bonnie Bracken, a name she used in June of 1937 when applying for a Social Security card. She was living in Fort Worth. The 1940 census shows Bonnie Bracken was unemployed and renting a home, and that she had lived in the same city 5 years earlier. Her marital status was given as widowed. Had Addie finally accepted her husband's death? Her name also appears in Fort Worth city directories, including the 1943 edition in which Addie, alias Bonnie, was again listed as the widow of James H. Bracken. Addie would remain in Fort Worth, quietly living there for 3 decades. Into her 80s, Addie could no longer care for herself, prompting her move into a convalescent home in Fort Worth. Having severed ties with her family and friends, Addie had no choice but to finally accept the aid of the Red Cross. A new Social Security number was issued to her in 1966, although she had secured a card nearly 30 years earlier under the alias Bonnie Bracken. During this time, her nephew, family genealogist Berry Greenwood, searched in vain for his missing aunt, ultimately entering a question mark for her date of death in family records. Addie died of a heart attack on May 31st, 1969, 9 days shy of her 88th birthday. Sadly, many of her relatives lived within a short distance, yet they wouldn't learn of her death for more than 20 years. Addie Bracken was buried in Rose Hill Memorial Park in Fort Worth. the same cemetery where Kennedy assassin Lee Harvey Oswald was buried 6 years earlier. She lies in an unmarked grave, her final resting place as obscure as the life she chose to live.